This is a brief follow-up to my previous article and video on the rationality of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theory is often used as a term that denigrates any suggestion that a conspiracy actually was involved in an event, very frequently a murder, a high-profile murder, like the Kennedy assassination. And it's become extremely popular in political usage and other contexts in the last 40 or 50 years. So what I want to argue here, or what I argue here, is basically that even when we look at supposedly solitary crimes like serial killers, in fact, we find that a substantial fraction, about 5 to 10% of them, are actually multiple offenders, conspiracies, people working together to kill people, even in these rather strange, out there crimes, which are often considered very much a solitary, the lone nut. The serial killer is supposedly usually a lone nut, but at least 5 to 10% of the cases, they're not. They're actually two or more people. So let me talk a little bit about my previous point about rationality, the use of the term conspiracy theory. And conspiracy theory is used in such a way as to say that, well, conspiracies are exceptionally rare or don't occur. Now, the people that use it will concede they're conspiracies, but they are invariably dismissing something as so far out and implausible. The notion that two or more people would get together to commit a crime, a murder, typically. Many of these famous conspiracy theories, like the Kennedy assassination or Martin Luther King or other questions about various events, they're actually murder cases. Now, they're high-profile murder cases. The victims are often powerful people, or in some way the events are thought to perhaps benefit or have been orchestrated by powerful people for some end, usually money and power. Now, the dictionary meaning of conspiracy theory is just the theory that some criminal or harmful event was orchestrated or performed by two or more people. That's really all it means. And this popular redefinition of conspiracy theory really to mean like something totally crazy. The language I use here is an irrational theory contradicted by evidence and reason. These have literally become synonymous to the point that you never want to use the term conspiracy theory except in this negative way. Because how else would you talk about a conspiracy theory? Right? There is, of course, other language. You could try collusion theory. Collusion is a technical term in antitrust law for a conspiracy to fix prices. But the natural way you would talk about thinking maybe there's a conspiracy involved or behind something that happens is conspiracy theory. And yet in our popular usage of our language, it's essentially been redefined to mean something that could never happen. It's very much like George Orwell's Newspeak in his dystopian novel 1984, where it becomes impossible to even think about something. So implicit in this kind of thinking is that conspiracies must be exceptionally rare. They don't happen very often, particularly in murders, right? Because actually the term conspiracy theory usually pops up in the context of a high-profile murder or possible murder, something like the purported suicide of so-called financier Jeffrey Epstein about a year ago. Now think about that, because let's say you're the police and you're investigating a murder. A woman's been murdered. There's her husband. Turns out her husband's been having an affair with his secretary at work. Turns out they increased the size of the life insurance policy on the wife, a few months before, and it looks like he's going to end up marrying the secretary. You might wonder, right? It looked at first like a robbery, right? He doesn't, it turns out, have a great alibi. His alibi was the secretary, who turns out to be his mistress. So at this point, the police should be considering, maybe this is a murder. Maybe the husband and the secretary, the mistress, got together and they decided to knock off the wife. It happens. Not far-fetched, actually. But in order to think about that, they have to say, we have a conspiracy theory. Maybe it was a robber. Maybe it was just a random, bizarre crime. But maybe it was a conspiracy involving these two people. Now, we can't think about that. That doesn't happen. Well, we can actually look at the FBI's crime statistics. This is 2019, and what I've highlighted here are murder cases where there's multiple offenders. So they're about 12.8% where there's a single victim, sort of like my example of the wife who's knocked off by, or may have been knocked off by her husband and his mistress. And multiple offenders. This is 1.9. So about 15% of murders, according to the FBI in 2019, in fact, were conspiracies in the way we would normally think about them. Now, that's great, but I've studied a lot of government statistics, including the FBI and the Department of Justice, and they can turn out to be very mushy and iffy. So the purpose of this discussion here is to follow up and say, well, can we look at some murder cases where we actually know the names of the people? It's not some government statistics, which may be very hard to penetrate. Do you see something similar? Even with serial killers, which are really crazy, far-out killers seemingly, we actually find that about 5 to 10% of so-called serial killer cases, these infamous, horrific murder cases, are committed by 2 or more people, at least according to the court cases. And I looked at, just to get some kind of statistics on this, I looked at a book called The Big Book of Serial Killers, Volume 1 by Jack Rosewitz, and it has 150 cases. And it turns out between 10 and at least 10 of the cases in it, and probably more, were multiple people. In other words, there was more than one person involved in the murder. So let me just kind of go through those briefly. They list Paul Bernardo, this is a Canadian serial killer. His accomplice was actually his wife, Carla Homolka, and they were both convicted. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Bono, both convicted, Hillside Strangler case. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, both convicted in some horrific murders in Southern California. William Bonin, also a Southern California case back in the 70s. He was convicted along with Gregory Miley, William Pugh, and James Monroe. Vernon Butts apparently committed suicide in prison, so he was never actually convicted. So an astonishing 5 people were involved in this case. Doug Clark was actually, these are how they were listed in the table of contents of the Big Book of Serial Killers, which lists pairs in some cases, but actually omits some of the accomplices. Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy, they were both convicted. Dean Corll is an infamous case in Houston, but he had at least 2 accomplices. Elmer Wayne Henley, who in fact killed Dean Corll, and David Owen Brooks, both of whom were convicted and sent to jail. I think they're still in jail. So that's 3 people convicted. This case in particular has lots of signs of other people involvement, of possibly some type of organized pornography, prostitution going on, and so on. I'll come back to that issue of somewhat larger conspiracies at the end, but there's no question these people were convicted and sent to jail. Elmer Wayne Henley more or less confessed. I'm not so sure about David Brooks. Delfina and married to Jesus Gonzalez. That's a Mexican case, but it was at least 2 women and possibly others. Patrick Kearney is a more iffy case. There's various reasons to suspect that his lover, David Douglas Hill, was involved in at least some of the murders, like John LeMay. He was never charged. I should say he was actually charged, but then he was let off, and he was never finally he was arrested. He was initially charged, but he was let off by the grand jury. So it's an iffy case, but there's reason to think it was 2 people. Randy Stephen Kraft, this is yet another Southern California freeway killer. There's 3 of them, Patrick Kearney, William Bonin, and Randy Stephen Kraft, all about the same time. But there's strong DNA and other evidence that there was another accomplice who was never caught, although there are people who suspect certain people that Kraft knew were that accomplice or accomplices. But anyway, he very likely had a accomplice. Leonard Lake and Charles Ng. Leonard Lake committed suicide after he was arrested. Charles Ng is on death row. John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo, these are the D.C. snipers. Again, they were convicted. David Parker Ray is a kind of a strange case, but it involved some other people that he were associated with. Cindy Hendy, Glenda Ray, that's Ray's daughter, and Dennis Yancey. So these people are all convicted, convicted. Fred West and Rosemary West, those are a couple in England many years ago, also convicted. There's Eileen Carol Warnos. That's a little perhaps iffier. But she was essentially turned in by her lover, Tyria Moore. But there's a lot of reason to be suspicious of Tyria Moore. And finally, we have the infamous Chicago serial killer, John Wayne Gacy. And there's various evidence that he, in fact, had an accomplice or accomplices. And I provide some references to that. We have a victim that got away or he let go who described another person that he could identify involved in the crime. Doesn't necessarily prove the serial killing cases involved an accomplice, but there's some reason, fairly credible reason to think there were other people involved. So if we look at this, so we're very conservative. We have 10 cases, or 6.67%. There are a number of cases. I count 3 of them as highly probable and 2 more as pretty good chance, but not as probable. So we get between 6% and 10%. I say 5 to 10% just to be kind of conservative. There are some internet claims that Donald Henry Gaskins, who's also in the table of contents, had accomplices, but I couldn't find any real evidence of that. It's not practical to check all of the 150, so what I did is a couple of them I knew about anyway from news reports, and I searched the internet for lists of serial killers who may have had accomplices, which is typically like 10 or 20 people. It's not as common for there to be an accomplice, at least one that's clearly proven and convicted in court and that kind of thing. But by comparing those, we're able to get to these numbers. So what does this tell us? It tells us that even with serial killers, which is often thought of as a very solitary, kind of bizarre crime, something like 5 to 10% of the cases involve conspiracies. Now, I have intentionally omitted various theories where there are larger, prostitution or pornography networks, pedophilia, various things like that. There are theories like that about some serial killer cases. And they're very hard to pin down. There are sort of weak circumstantial evidence that you'll find in books like Programmed to Kill by Dave McGowan, who's not a relative of mine, or Mary Terry's The Ultimate Evil. I just omitted all of that and went strictly with people where they're either convicted in a court of law or there's forensic evidence, there's really solid evidence from the court case or the police investigation that there probably was or certainly an accomplice. So in the Randy Kraft case, there's DNA evidence that someone with different DNA from Kraft was a perpetrator of one of the crimes. One comment is that in the Dean McCarl case, there's a lot of very strange things in this case and evidence that there was something more involved. Videotapes of the victims turned up in a later pornography investigation and various other things like that. And in fact, both, I think, Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks claimed that Corll told them that he was working with a larger group of people. So it's not impossible that some of these crimes, there's more to it than the list I have here. There are undetected larger conspiracies. When you look at just the crime statistics in general, what you actually find is where you have larger conspiracies. You have gangs, you have organized crime, you have the so-called mafia, you have these other kinds of groups involved. It's actually less likely for the crimes to ever be solved, the murders to be solved. A lot of the unsolved murders, which are something like 27% or more of murders in the U.S. are never solved. Those are often gang violence in inner city areas, and the reason they're not solved is that people are afraid. One of the main reasons that they're not solved is people are afraid of the killers, the gangs. And even if they saw something, even if they can provide some information, they don't because they're afraid. And that certainly would be apply in these extreme kind of crimes, like, say, the Dean Corll case, that some people might not talk about something. So we should consider that some of these cases may actually be larger and involve more people. But here I'm just saying, well, what do we find when we look at these cases where there's very clear convictions, very clear evidence that there more than one person was involved in the crime, in a murder, mind you. So what does that tell us? What it tells us, and is my major point, is conspiracies happen. In fact, they happen in murders all the time. They're not unusual. They make up a substantial percentage, maybe 5 to 10% of serial killer cases, probably 15% of murders based on murders that are solved, and a higher percentage of the unsolved murders, where if you look at the investigations, again, these tend to be inner city, rough neighborhoods. They tend to be gang violence. So conspiracies play a substantial role in many murders. The term conspiracy theory is being applied generally to murders where the victims or the probable perpetrators are very powerful people or high-profile people. But the evidence is actually very clear that it's not unreasonable to suspect and consider a conspiracy theory in a murder. It happens, and it happens fairly often. It's not like 1 in 1,000 murders or 1 in 10,000 or this kind of, how would you ever think there was a conspiracy involved in a murder, which is the way that conspiracy theory is used over and over again in discussing high-profile murders like the Kennedy assassination or the recent suspicious suicide of Jeffrey Epstein, just to give 2 prominent examples. So in conclusion, data for so-called serial killer murders shows a significant, about 5 to 10% of those murders are committed by conspiracies. The numbers could be larger. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us. You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.